Hey guys, my name is Mannequin. Welcome back to Mastering EDM with FL Studio. So today's video, we're starting a series in music theory, and it's not going to be too in-depth just because I don't have that much music theory under my belt, but we're going to cover some of the basics so you could kind of get an idea as to, a little bit more about what you're doing in terms of music theory and keying in melodies, notes, chords, and everything like that. So that'll be fun, but we're not going to be using FL Studio that much in terms of like the technical aspects. We've pretty much covered all that stuff in previous videos. Right now, we're getting more into what's going to be not so much how to use FL Studio, but how to use it well, I guess is the best way to say it. So instead of going behind, and just trying to learn all the tools, we're going to be learning the theory about how to use the tools well. So I have 3XOSC here, and I'm going to open up the piano roll. So if you went in and started jumping in and keying in notes, you probably realize that it's rather hard to get a pretty good sound off of just, randomly dropping in notes and then tweaking them and then fixing them and tweaking them and fixing them and tweaking them and fixing them and tweaking them. And it kind of just tends to be a pain to, figure out a good note progression. So that's where music theory comes in. There's a method to the madness, and if you learn that, it won't be that hard to, get some, just make things easier, I guess is the way to put it. So, so what we're going to start with is, if you look at the piano roll here, you can see that we have letters A through G, and then they just kind of repeat themselves throughout the keyboard here. So we have all the way up to B10. Oh, that was really loud. And then we have anywhere as low as C0. So that's a lot of notes to choose from. How do you know which ones to choose? Well, one of the easiest things to remember is these things called octaves. And I'm going to play this back. You're going to kind of get a little bit of an idea what octaves really are. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play notes that are octaves of each other. And then somewhere in the mix, I'm going to throw a random note that is not part of the octave. So I'll play this again, but this time I'll play a different note, and you can kind of see, you'll probably be able to tell which one's the odd one out. So we kind of had that last one there, which was the odd one out. It doesn't really follow the pattern of... like, tonally, these notes that are an octave apart, they sound very similar, except they're just higher pitched. It's kind of hard to describe it, but you'll get used to it after a while. So we have all these C's here are going to have a very similar tone, and essentially, if you have your note progression going something like this, for example, and then you select all these, you just kind of, you're like, I like this note progression, but I want it higher pitched. You just move this C up an octave to the next C. And one thing to remember is that's always going to be a 12 note difference. So if you move up 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, you will always end up at the next octave there. So now that said, we don't call this moving up notes. We call it semitones or half steps actually. So let me pull up this little notepad. It'll help you a little bit. 1 octave is equal to 12 notes. That's not a unit of measurement. I'm just putting that there so it's easier for you to remember. And which is equal to 12 semitones, which is equal to 12 half steps. So all these are essentially the same. And that means that when we go from this note to this note, that's either a half step or it's a semitone. And just keep that in mind because we're going to use that in just a second here. But before I do that, I do want to mention one thing. You notice how I've been talking about C here, and C actually is gray, while the other keys are a lighter shade of gray. The reason is because C happens to be one of the easiest notes to work with in a lot of respects. So that's what we tend to use when explaining things. Even though it goes from A to G, typically we actually use notes from C to C, and we kind of think about things in that sort of sense, just because it's easier musically. You'll find out why in just a second here. But before I get into that, one final thing about naming conventions. You'll notice here we have these white keys and the black keys. The black keys don't have a title in them because they actually have two names. So this key right here is C sharp because it's above C, and D flat because it's below D. So really, like if you click here, you'll see that's C sharp. And it doesn't really matter which name you use. Just keep in mind both of them because, for example, this one is always called B flat, even though it's technically A sharp as well. There's very few cases where you will hear that it's called A sharp. Most of the time, it will be B flat. I have no idea why, and I honestly don't know what the purpose is for having sharps versus flats, but in terms of the naming scheme, I have no idea why they do that. But just remember that the little sharp symbol is the hash symbol, and the symbol for flats is actually going to be a B. It's like an italic B, lowercase b. So just keep that in mind. That's what those are. They're just the black keys, because the black keys don't have their own letters. If they did, then we wouldn't have sharps and flats. But we do have sharps and flats, so yeah, just kind of deal with that. It's not that hard to remember. Just, if you ever see those sharps, just remember that's what it is. It's one of the black keys somewhere. So yeah, that's it. But now we could finally get into what I talked about when I said semitones and half steps. So we have these things called keys. We have, just hitting any key here is a note. That's pretty simple there. Now, what a key is, or a scale, is a collection of notes that sound good together. So instead of just randomly selecting notes to make a melody, what you do instead is you actually have a plan as to which notes you're going to use. So a good example here is the C major scale. So what we do is we follow this pattern: a whole step, a half step, a whole step, a whole step, a whole step, and a half step. So I don't know why they did this as well. This is kind of a confusing thing. But if you go from here to here, that's a whole step. And if you go from here to here, that's a half step. So just keep that in mind. Kind of confusing, but whatever. So anyway, the pattern for the major scale is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So we're going to do that here. Whole. Actually, we choose our starting note. I apologize. We choose our starting note, and then we go a whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Now you'll notice the last half there brings us back to C, so we'll just erase that because essentially it's just repeating this other C. Now, what we could do with this scale is we could select it and we could copy it and then move it up an octave and then just keep on doing this. And the reason I'm doing this is to show you guys that, yes, you can use this, anywhere in the in this entire piano roll here. Like it just repeats itself. So just keep that in mind. I'm not restricting you to one octave. You can move it up an octave, you can move it down an octave, you can move it down 10 octaves, and it's still going to be in the key of your song. So all those notes will be fine. But anyway, when you have your key planned out like this, you just have to make sure that whenever you make a melody, it's inside your key. So for example, this D sharp here is not in key, so we'd have to move that up or down somewhere. And all the rest here are in key because it lines up, you can see. Whoops. All those line up, so that means they are in key and you could use them. That's basically how it works in terms of scales and keys. You just choose any note to start on, and then you apply this pattern and you'll get it. What that means is if you actually memorize one simple pattern, you can move that anywhere else and you'll have all the scales. So actually not one simple pattern for all the scales, but you need to know two patterns and then you'll know almost all the scales. So the first one here, like I said, we are using this reference. We are using this reference to get the major scale. So once we have this lined up, we can move this anywhere else and boom. There, for example, we have a G major scale because the first note's on G, and we can move this anywhere else. That's an F sharp major scale, and once again, that's an E major scale because all that matters is the spacing between the notes. So that said, you now know basically half of the scales, and really, the easy way to remember this is here is if you start at C and choose all the white notes, then you have the C major scale. That's a really easy thing to remember. That's why I said we start with C often, because if you just go with C, then all you have is, if you just go with all the white notes there, then boom, that's the C major scale. So that's really easy there, and you could use that for any major scale. You just follow that pattern for all the white notes there, and you can just pull it anywhere and it'll be really easy. So that's how you could get any major key really fast. Now, that said, major keys tend to actually have a overriding tone to them. So if you hear a song that's in a major key, usually it's like a bouncy and happy song. A good example of this is a lot of Avicii's tracks in his album True, because they all sound, not all of them, but a lot of them sound relatively happy and bouncy. And that's attributed to the fact that they are using major scales. That said, most EDM is not in a major scale. It's actually in a minor scale. And this includes like hip hop, dubstep, trance, and all those things. Most of them are in minor scale. So you're going to need to learn the minor scale pattern, which is whole, half, whole, half, whole. So we'll do this again here. And you start with C, you do a whole, half, whole, half, whole, and then you go whole again is back at C. So we don't need to put that one in there. But this is going to be your pattern for the minor key here. And once again, once you learn this, all you have to do is move it around. Move it around, and then you have any minor key. Now, if you can't remember both of those because you don't want to remember the steps, keep this in mind. I said that if we choose all the white keys, then that's our major scale. But what you could actually do is you could start on a different note and choose all the white keys and get a minor scale. Now, how do you do this? Interestingly, C major is a parallel key to A minor. That means if I get C major here, this is actually going to be kind of interesting. So this is C major here, and if I go in and then choose all the white keys starting from A, we have two keys that are very similar. Now, watch, if I pull them up next to each other, they won't match. Although, unfortunately, I actually added the last extra note there, so we'll move this back to A here. Get rid of that last note. Here we go. So it's the same number of notes, but you'll notice they don't match anymore if I line them up to each other. But if I put, let's see here, where does it line up? If I get the third note here and line it up there, and then move these two up, move these two up an octave, then I'll get the exact same key. So what does this mean? This actually means that there are, for every single key, there is what's called a parallel key. And that means if you get this C major key, it's the exact same notes as an A minor key. What's the difference? Well, the difference is the note that it starts on. So that is, it's actually kind of important, and you'll learn that more and more as you start to mess around with making melodies and stuff. But just kind of remember, if you can't remember the patterns for major and minor, then just make the C major scale, which is all the white keys, or make the A minor scale, which is also all the white keys, but instead we are starting from the starting from the A note, and then we have all these ones, and that's our two patterns there. We could actually look and compare it as well if you want to. So you could pause the video here and then compare them and just kind of see the whole and half steps and how that plays out. But once you get these patterns, then you could have a C minor scale or a C major scale and choose between those. Most of the time you'll go for the minor scale. So if you remember that start from A, choose all the white keys, that's your minor scale. Then once again, you can move it anywhere in the stack, and that's C sharp minor, B minor, F sharp minor, and then you could just make sure that when you key in your melody, all the notes are in the right spot and they all line up, and then it will be in key, and it'll be a lot easier to get things sounding good and sounding like unified together. Now, the final thing I want to mention is rules are made to be broken. So that said, don't break them too frivolously in the beginning. I think I heard it somewhere. It's like you need to learn the rules before you could break them, something like that. I don't remember where that quote's from, but the idea is get used to working in key and having all your notes that they fit in this scale, so that your track is in key. and then you know, it'll be a lot easier to work. And then maybe let's say sometime you need something to have a lot more impact. You want something to be very dramatic and kind of eerie and kind of weird. It just kind of detracts the original pattern and does something really cool and twists things, puts them on their heads, everything like that. Then what you do is you choose a note that's out of key, and you really throw people off and get a really cool sound out of it. Now that said, you can't just throw in any random one at any random time. It has to be a very deliberate decision. It has to be well thought out, and it has to be tested. So it is very difficult to do well, but it can be done. So just keep that in mind. Rules are made to be broken, but you kind of need to know. You need to know the rules beforehand so that you could know how to break them. So that's pretty much all I have for this video. I apologize it went a little bit longer than the other videos, but at the same time, hopefully this was some good information for you and gave you a little bit of an idea as to where to start in terms of music theory and just kind of, you know, going from knowing nothing about where to place notes to knowing a little bit more about what notes are going to sound good together. So, so that's all I have for you guys this time. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.